The lake had always been more than just water and shoreline to Luke. It was the place where he learned to fish with his grandfather, where he skipped stones with his brother, and where he found refuge during the most chaotic chapters of his life. Tucked deep in a quiet forest, far from the noise of the city, the lake was nestled like a secret the world had forgotten. It had been in his family for over 3 generations, passed down like a treasure no bank could quantify. When his grandfather passed, the land came to Loopholes with a key to the small, worn dam hidden beneath a thick canopy of trees. Most didn't even know it existed, but it had been built by his great-grandfather during the 1950s to manage the seasonal flooding that once plagued the region. Luke left his job as an engineer. Not long after inheriting the property, he traded office cubicles for the scent of pine and the sound of bullfrogs at night. He built a modest eco-cabin by hand, using reclaimed wood, solar panels, and a rainwater harvesting system. He didn't need much. The lake gave him more than any paycheck could. Sunsets painted the water gold. Deer drank peacefully on the banks. Each season added its own rhythm to the place. Cracking in winter, blossoms in spring, cicadas in summer, and crisp winds in fall. He documented bird migrations and kept a nature journal. It was a sanctuary, untouched and deeply alive. Though isolated, Luke occasionally drove into town for supplies. Over time, he noticed something unsettling. Survey flags appeared near the road bordering the southern edge of his land. Then came the machine's bulldozers, concrete mixers, and workers in reflective vests. When he asked questions, no one gave him answers. Then a sign went up. Future site of Hidden Hills Estates, luxury waterfront living. Luke felt his stomach drop. Waterfront? That meant his lake. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Surely no one would be bold enough to build on private property. But within weeks, the banks of the lake were being drained. Trees were being clear-cut. Frogs and turtles, displaced from their habitats, wandered toward his cabin in confusion. Luke checked his paperwork. Everything was in order. He had full deed ownership of the lake, the surrounding wetlands, and the ancient dam. But when he tried to confront the construction foreman, he was brushed off. "Take it up with the HOA," the man said, pointing toward a newly erected office trailer. That was the first time Luke heard of the Hidden Hills Owners Association, a corporate entity with lawyers, developers, and influence. A few meetings later, he realized the terrifying truth. They weren't just building near the lake, they were building on it. Entire plots were being sold as waterfront homes. And the HOA was boasting exclusive lake access. It's a selling point in their brochures. The worst blow came when he received a formal letter, accusing him of trespassing on his own land. The HOA claimed that their environmental consultants had redrawn boundaries that put the lake inside their development zone. The audacity was staggering. Luke's fury grew with every insult to his family's legacy. He had no interest in lawsuits or petty arguments, but they were desecrating sacred ground. That lake had healed him after a divorce, given him purpose after burnout, and reconnected him to something primal and pure. And now, it was being violated by greedy hands and forged paperwork. He walked to the dam one evening, dusted off the old steel valve, and ran his fingers along the rusted bolt. Something ancient stirred inside him, not vengeance, but justice. If they wanted to steal the lake, they'd have to deal with what lived beneath it. The days of quiet were officially over. Where once there had been only birdsong and the gentle rustling of wind through the trees, there was now the ceaseless groan of machinery and shouting of workers echoing across the water. Every morning, Luke woke up to bulldozers tearing through the forest edge like ravenous beasts, carving roads and flattening earth without a second thought. Piles of concrete blocks and PVC pipes were stacked like monuments to destruction. What had once been a mirror-like lake reflecting the untouched sky was now murky, disturbed by tire tracks and dredging equipment that clawed at its edges. The worst part wasn't even the noise, it was the arrogance. The HOA and the construction company carried themselves like they owned the world. Luxury homes began springing up in mockery of the landscape, each one advertised as lakeside paradise, ignoring the fact that the lake itself was being slowly choked. Luke watched as synthetic lawns replaced wild grasses and heavy machinery. Compacted soil that had been soft and alive for centuries. They even installed fake boulders to give the illusion of natural terrain on land that had once been truly untouched. The irony made him sick. Luke tried reason first. He approached the project manager, an overly polite man named Russell, who had the smile of someone who'd never worked a day with his hands. Luke laid out his deed, the original land surveys, even photos of his grandfather fishing in the very spot they were now building a dock. Oh. Russell barely looked at them before waving him off with corporate jargon. "This has already gone through legal review," he said smoothly. "You can take it up with the county." The county had already been bought, or at least persuaded. Luke's emails to the zoning office went unanswered. The clerk's voice on the phone was tight and dismissive. He wasn't the first person to complain, she implied, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. Then came the threats. First, a notice on his cabin's door, unauthorized structure subject to removal, and a formal letter claiming he was interfering with HOA business and subject to fines for obstruction. Luke was stunned. They were treating him like the intruder. He was being boxed in, surrounded by legal walls built on fraudulent foundations. The land he had lived on peacefully for years, the land his grandfather had died protecting, was being stolen out from under him in, the world called it, development. Neighbors he had once shared coffee with at the town diner now avoided eye contact. Some had sold their land to the developers, others were too afraid to speak. The HOA had brought not just concrete and vinyl siding, it had brought silence, submission, and control. Luke felt a growing sense of alienation, like he was a man caught in the past, defending something the world had already decided to forget, but he refused to let go. He dug deeper into the town's land records, uncovering inconsistencies, missing signatures, and suspicious zoning changes made during late-night council meetings. It became clear the HOA wasn't just bold, it was corrupt. And then one morning, as he walked the narrow trail along the lake's northern bend, he saw it. A concrete culvert being installed directly into the lake, draining water into an artificial retention pond meant for the new homes. They were literally siphoning life from the heart of his land. That was the moment everything changed. Luke stood by the shoreline, watching the slow whirl of water as it funneled away, and he felt something in him harden. He realized this was no longer about boundaries or paperwork. It was about survival. His lake was being bled dry by people who didn't understand what they were destroying. They saw it as a backdrop for luxury. He knew it as a living thing. And living things don't go quietly. Luke sat at the edge of the cabin porch document sprawled across the wooden table, his laptop humming beside a cold cup of coffee he'd forgotten to drink. Every fiber of his being was focused on the pile of land surveys, zoning documents, and legal filings he had been collecting over the past few weeks. What started as confusion had turned into a full-blown investigation. The deeper he dug, the more the rot revealed itself. The Hidden Hills Owners Association wasn't just overstepping boundaries, they were orchestrating a strategic, calculated theft. He found discrepancies in parcel maps between the county website and the original deeds from his grandfather's estate. Boundary lines had been mysteriously redrawn. New plats filed under shell companies included vague phrasing about public water access and community development easements that had never been approved in open meetings. He highlighted and circled, cross-referenced, and annotated until he could barely see straight. But it was all there the HOA had manipulated. The system to manufacture legitimacy, they hadn't acquired his land. They had faked their way into it, determined to make his case. Luke scheduled a meeting with the county's land use officer, armed with every document, map, and photograph he could muster. He arrived early, nerves high but hope intact. But the official, a middle-aged man, with a rehearsed politeness and a suspiciously blank expression, barely gave his papers a glance. "These things happen," he said vaguely. "Lines change, land gets reclassified." Luke pushed back, pointing. "Out the fraud, the inconsistencies, the forged signatures." The man leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "If you believe you've been wronged, You're welcome to hire legal counsel. That's when Luke understood the game was rigged. System wasn't broken, it was working exactly as it was designed, for those with money and power. He left the office feeling like he was walking uphill through molasses. And as he drove back to his cabin, the surrounding homes half-built, gaudy, sterile felt like strangers crashing a sacred ceremony. The land was no longer being shaped by nature, but by entitlement. A few days later, a neighbor named Jody knocked on his door under cover of dusk. She had worked for the HOA briefly as a consultant before quitting. Her hands trembled as she clutched a USB drive and a stack of printouts. "They're planning to use eminent domain," she whispered. "They know the lake isn't theirs, but they're pushing to declare it for public utility use, to serve as a water source for the community's irrigation system." Luke stared at her, the words sinking like lead in his gut. This wasn't just about his land anymore. This was a takeover. Jody also handed him a transcript from a private HOA board meeting. The board members openly discussed pushing Luke out, describing him as an obstacle and a reputation risk. One board member even joked about bulldozing around his cabin to encourage relocation. Luke's jaw tightened. These were mistakes or misunderstandings, they were deliberate acts of erasure. He thought of the dam, relic of old engineering that few remembered, but he knew intimately. His grandfather had built it with care and precision, a manual control system tucked away in a stone outcropping, cleverly disguised by nature. For decades, it had maintained the lake's water levels, protecting both the land and nearby wildlife, and it still worked. Hidden, untouched, under his full legal control. Luke stood by the dam that evening as the moon rose. The wheel was rusted, but intact, the metal cool and familiar under his hand. He didn't turn it, not yet. But he knew the time was coming. If the HOA was going to steal the life of the land, they needed to be reminded what that life could do when it flowed freely. He didn't want war. But they had declared it, and nature was on his side. The rain came harder than expected that week, as if the sky itself had grown tired of the arrogance creeping across the land. Fat drops pounded the forest canopy, soaking the ground, swelling the lake, and transforming once dry paths into muddy trails. Luke stood at the edge of the dam, his boots sinking into the saturated earth, watching the water rise inch by inch. The sound was different, now louder, more restless-like. The lake was no longer content to be still, the homes still under construction sat arrogantly close to the shoreline, their foundations bare and vulnerable. It was as if they had never considered the land might push back. Luke had spent the last few days preparing in silence. He cleared debris from the dam spillway and checked the integrity of the old release valve, wiping decades of grime from the steel mechanism. His grandfather's engineering still held strong, a testament to a time when builders respected the land they worked with. Luke knew exactly what would happen if the valve was opened, how the force of the water would rush through the ravine. Not in a destructive rage, but as a reclaiming act of balance. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but their ignorance left him no choice when the final insult came. A letter slipped under his door, warning that the HOA would begin surveying his structure for relocation. Luke knew the line had been crossed. It wasn't just bureaucracy anymore. It was a threat, a promise to erase him completely. That night, under the cloak of rain and moonlight, Luke walked to the dam alone. No camera crews, and no speeches, no legal teams. Just him, his land, and the wand. Pulsing weight of generations behind him, he grasped the heavy wheel, muscles tensed against the rust and resistance. As it turned, a deep groan echoed through the dam like a beast awakening from slumber. Water surged forward, a controlled torrent, funneling through channels that had not seen movement in years. The lake didn't roar, it flowed with purpose, cutting through the artificial embankments and creeping toward the homes like a tide, reclaiming what had been wrongfully taken by morning. The first calls to emergency services began. It half-built. Basements were flooded. Construction equipment had sunk into the mud. The pristine concrete pathways of hidden hills were cracked and buckling under the pressure. Luke stood on the hill above, unnoticed, arms crossed as chaos unfolded below. He didn't smile, There was no satisfaction in watching destruction, only vindication. The HOA scrambled. Officials blamed unexpected weather events. But it didn't take long for someone to notice the open dam valve. That afternoon, Luke uploaded a video. Calm, collected, and direct. He explained the history of the lake, the forged documents, the unlawful construction, and the dam his grandfather built. He showed the deeds, the evidence, the paper trail of corruption. Then, without anger, he simply said, "I opened the dam because they left me no choice. Water belongs to the land, not to greed." Within hours, the video went viral. Across the country, tired of corporate overreach and HOA horror stories, flooded the comment sections with support. Environmentalists, lawyers, and even state officials began sharing his story. Luke didn't revel in the attention, stayed at the cabin, far from the noise, letting the world do what it would with the truth. Meanwhile, the water receded, but the damage was done. The Hidden Hills was halted indefinitely, buyers withdrew, and the development was placed under investigation. Luke returned to the dam each evening, watching the lake breathe again. It wasn't vengeance he'd unleashed, it was restoration. The land had spoken, not with rage, but with clarity. And finally, someone had listened. The aftermath settled slowly, like dust after a storm. But this storm had left no room for reconstruction, only revelation. The headlines came first. Local news channels scrambled to cover the dramatic collapse of the Hidden Hills development. Then came state-level environmental agencies, awakened by the viral footage Luke had uploaded. Public outrage ignited like wildfire. News anchors quoted Luke's words. Podcasts dissected the story. He'd become, unintentionally, a symbol of man who defended his land. Against corporate greed, using the very force the HOA had tried to control, investigators poured over the development's paperwork, and it didn't take long for the truth to surface. Forged signatures, falsified zoning changes, legal water redirection. The developer and several HOA board members were indicted for fraud, bribery, and environmental violations. The state froze the Hidden Hills project indefinitely, and contractors fled the site, leaving behind skeletal frames of luxury homes now blackened with mold and warped by flood damage. Buyers demanded their deposits back, lawsuits stacked like firewood. Luke watched it all unfold from his porch, untouched by the chaos. He hadn't opened the dam to destroy, only to defend. The lake had merely followed its natural path once freed from the blockage. But people who build homes on stolen ground are rarely ready for what the land remembers. Still, Luke didn't celebrate. His heart was too full of mixed feelings: relief, exhaustion, a deep ache for what had almost been lost. For days, he avoided the phone calls, the media requests, the book deals. He wasn't interested in being a symbol or a story. He just wanted his peace back. Jody returned to visit, this time during daylight. She brought news. The HOA had been formally dissolved. Its board members banned from serving on any housing association again. The county had begun a full audit of all development plans in the area. And perhaps most satisfying of all, the land adjacent to Luke's property was being reviewed for protected wetland status. She smiled as she handed him the paperwork. "You did it," she said softly. Luke looked out over the lake, calm and whole again, and only nodded. He hadn't done it for revenge. He'd done it because no one else would. The next weeks were quiet. The heavy machinery disappeared. Wildlife began to return. Frogs croaked again at night. The blue heron that had vanished during construction returned to its perch near the reeds. Luke spent his mornings repairing what little damage had been done to the edges of his land, replanting native grasses, rebuilding the paths, restoring the balance his grandfather had taught him to honor. He resealed the dam valve and reinforced the spillway. The structure, though old, was built to last, just like the man who had left it in his care. Visitors came,